Wren adjusted the collar of his borrowed diplomatic jacket for the seventh time in less than a minute, which, according to the tiny blinking indicator on his wrist console, qualified as statistically suspicious behavior. He ignored it. The jacket did not belong to him. The insignia stitched into its fabric did not belong to him, and judging by the way the sleeves seemed to subtly tighten every time he exhaled too loudly, it did not particularly like him either. Somewhere far above, the ceiling of the Galactic Banquet Hall shimmered with slow-moving constellations, rearranging themselves into patterns that probably meant something very important to someone who had actually studied for this event. Wren had studied a list of names for exactly 11 minutes before being pushed through 3 security fields and handed a glass of something that was gently vibrating. He stared at the drink for a moment. It stared back. He decided not to start their relationship with hostility and held it carefully instead. The hall was enormous in a way that made his sense of scale give up entirely. Delegates moved like carefully choreographed thoughts, their forms ranging from elegantly humanoid to geometrically confusing. Translation fields hummed faintly in the air, layering meaning over sound, though occasionally the system lagged and produced phrases like honored meat structure instead of esteemed colleague. Wren suspected he might accidentally agree to something legally binding just by nodding at the wrong moment. He was not supposed to be here. That thought repeated itself with comforting consistency. He was supposed to be on a transport back to a much smaller station, where the chairs were normal, the air did not sparkle, and the only thing that tried to communicate telepathically was the coffee machine, which had once politely suggested he reconsider his life choices. Instead, he had been informed, very quickly and by someone who was already leaving, that he was now representing humanity at the Galactic Summit because the actual representative had developed an urgent and very convincing illness involving gravity intolerance. Just observe, they had said. Do not initiate contact. Do not improvise. Wren had a long and impressive history of doing exactly what he was told, right up until the moment he didn't. He moved along the perimeter of the hall, trying to look like someone who understood why the floor occasionally shifted color beneath his feet. Every few steps, a soft chime would indicate he had crossed into a new diplomatic zone. At one point, the floor turned a polite shade of blue, and his wrist console displayed a message that read, "You are now considered mildly important." He almost turned around immediately. Tables were arranged in elegant arcs, each one marked with symbols that hovered just above their surfaces. Wren scanned them, searching for anything that resembled the designation he had been given. Most of the symbols looked like they had been designed by someone who disliked straight lines. Eventually, he spotted something that vaguely matched the pattern on his console. A cluster of soft, shifting lights that felt less like a label and more like a suggestion. There was an empty chair. He paused. Not because the chair looked unusual, but because everything else in the room was so carefully occupied that the emptiness felt intentional. The chair itself was slightly more ornate than the others, its surface reflecting the ambient light in subtle, controlled ways. It did not glow. It did not hum. It simply existed, with a quiet confidence that made Wren assume it belonged to someone important who was late. He looked around. No one was approaching it. No one was even looking at it. "Well," he muttered under his breath, "either I'm early or I've just made a terrible decision." He chose optimism. It had gotten him this far, which was admittedly not very far, but still. Wren stepped forward and sat. The chair adjusted instantly, molding itself to his posture with a precision that felt both comfortable and slightly invasive. He let out a small, surprised breath as the vibrating drink in his hand calmed, as if acknowledging his new seating arrangement. For a brief, hopeful second, nothing happened. Then everything stopped. It was not gradual. It was not subtle. It was as if someone had reached into the fabric of the hall and pressed a single, decisive pause. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Movement froze. Even the constellations above seemed to hesitate, their slow dance interrupted by something they could not quite process. Wren blinked. He slowly turned his head to the left, then to the right, and found himself at the exact center of a silence so complete it felt like a physical force. Hundreds of eyes, some visible, some implied, were directed at him. His wrist console, usually eager to provide unnecessary commentary, had gone completely dark. "That's new," he whispered. He considered standing up immediately, perhaps apologizing to the nearest life form and blaming a navigational error. Unfortunately, his body had decided that remaining perfectly still was the safest option, which, given the circumstances, might have been correct. And then, beside him, someone moved. The presence was immediate and undeniable, like the sudden awareness of gravity after forgetting it for a moment. Ren turned his head, very carefully, as if any sudden motion might trigger something dramatic and irreversible. She was already looking at him. At first glance, she could have been mistaken for human. The illusion held just long enough to be reassuring before the details settled into place. Her skin carried a faint, luminous quality, not glowing, but reflecting light with an unnatural precision. Her features were composed, deliberate, as if shaped by a standard that allowed no room for accident. And from beneath her silver hair, long ears extended gracefully, curving back in a way that marked her as something entirely other. Her eyes met his, steady and unhurried. Ren's mind, which had been doing its best to remain calm, chose that exact moment to supply him with a helpful realization. "Oh," he said quietly, "that's why the chair was empty." The woman, no, the queen, because there was no other word that fit the way the entire room seemed to orbit her existence, regarded him for a long, silent moment. Then, without activating any visible translator, she spoke. "Human," she said, her voice arriving in his understanding, as if it had always been there. "Why are you sitting in my seat?" Ren considered several possible answers, discarded all of them, and settled on the only one that felt honest enough to survive whatever came next. "I thought it was available," he said. There was a pause, and then, just barely, at the edge of something ancient and controlled, her expression shifted. She smiled. The silence did not end so much as it cautiously retreated, like something intelligent deciding not to interfere yet. Ren became aware of sound returning in layers, the faint hum of translation fields rebooting, the distant clink of alien glassware, the quiet, collective realization that he had not been immediately disintegrated. He took this as a promising sign. Unfortunately, he was still sitting in the wrong chair. He considered standing up again, slowly, respectfully, perhaps with a small, apologetic bow. The problem was that the woman beside him, Queen Ivara, his brain now supplied with unhelpfully accurate clarity, had not asked him to move. She had asked him why he was there, and then she had smiled. Not warmly, not coldly, but in a way that suggested she had just discovered something mildly interesting in an otherwise predictable universe. Ren, who had never been anyone's mildly interesting discovery before, found himself unsure how to proceed. "I can move," he offered carefully, lifting one hand a few centimeters, as if testing whether the gesture itself might trigger a diplomatic incident. "In fact, I am very good at moving. It's one of my stronger skills." Ivara did not look at his hand. She continued to look at his face, studying him with a level of attention that felt less like observation and more like analysis. Around them, the hall had resumed motion, but not naturally. Conversations restarted in fragments. Glances flickered and then lingered, and more than one delegate appeared to be pretending to drink something while very obviously watching Ren. "You sat," Ivara said, her voice still bypassing every translation system in the room, without hesitation. Ren nodded once. "Yes, that was, in retrospect, a bold choice. You did not ask permission." "I assumed," he said, then paused, reconsidering his life decisions. "Incorrectly." Another pause. This one stretched, but not uncomfortably. It felt deliberate, like a space being left open for something to grow into. Ivara's gaze shifted briefly, sweeping across the hall. Ren followed it instinctively and immediately regretted it. Every table seemed to be watching them in some way. A crystalline delegate had rotated its entire upper body to face their direction, which Ren suspected was not considered subtle in its culture. A cluster of beings composed of softly glowing threads had gone completely still, their light dimming as if they were holding their breath. "Am I in danger?" Ren asked quietly, keeping his eyes forward again. Avara's answer came without delay. No, he let out a slow breath. That's good, that's very good. I like that outcome. You have caused disruption, she continued as if clarifying a minor detail, but not danger. Ren considered that. Is there a category between those two where I could comfortably exist for the rest of the evening? Avera's expression shifted again, just slightly. If it was amusement, it was the kind that had to pass through several layers of control before becoming visible. You may remain, she said. Ren blinked. Remain? As in, continue sitting here? Yes. He glanced down at the chair, as if expecting it to object. It did not. It remained perfectly supportive, which felt like a betrayal. Right, he said. Of course, remain. That makes sense. It did not make sense. A server approached their table, moving with the smooth precision of something that had been designed for exactly this purpose. It carried a tray of small, hovering dishes, each one containing something that looked either delicious or sentient. The server paused just at the edge of their table and hesitated. Ren had never seen hesitation programmed so clearly into a machine before. Avar did not look at it. Proceed, she said. The server complied instantly, lowering the tray. One of the dishes drifted toward Ren, settling in front of him with a soft, polite glow. Inside was a cluster of translucent spheres that gently pulsed, as if aware they were being observed. Ren stared at them. They're not going to initiate conversation, are they? He asked. They are food, Avar replied. That has been said about many things that later proved to have opinions. Eva reached out and selected one of the spheres with precise, elegant movement. She consumed it without hesitation. Ren watched carefully. There were no immediate signs of distress, transformation, or philosophical debate. All right, he said, picking one up. I trust your judgment, mostly because I don't have a better option. He placed it in his mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sphere dissolved into a cascade of flavors that his brain struggled to categorize. It was sweet, but not quite. Bright, but not in a way that made sense. There was a brief, unmistakable sensation that it was trying to explain something to him, and then it was gone. Ren blinked. I think that just introduced itself. Ivara watched him. And? I'm not sure if I liked it, he admitted, but I respect it. Around them, the tension in the hall began to shift. It did not disappear, but it changed shape, becoming something less rigid, more curious. Conversations resumed with slightly more confidence. A few delegates even looked away, as if deciding that whatever was happening at this table was no longer an immediate threat to galactic stability. You are not behaving as expected, Avara said. Ren smiled faintly. That's because I don't know what's expected. That is evident. He leaned back slightly, then immediately straightened when he remembered that leaning in the wrong direction might also be illegal here. If it helps, he added, I'm equally confused. I just tried to make it look intentional. Avara's gaze lingered on him, thoughtful now, rather than analytical. In my people's tradition, she said slowly, this seat is never taken by another. Not by mistake, not by ignorance, not by design. Ren nodded. That sounds like a very clear rule. It is. And yet, he gestured lightly at himself, here I am, a statistical anomaly with a seating problem. The corner of her mouth shifted again. Yes, she said, you are. For the first time since he had sat down, Ren allowed himself to relax, just a fraction. Not because the situation made sense, but because it clearly didn't, and somehow that seemed to be working in his favor. He glanced around the hall once more, taking in the strange, beautiful, and deeply complicated gathering he had accidentally disrupted. Then he looked back at Ivara. So, he said with a small, uncertain smile, what usually happens next? Ivara did not answer immediately, and Ren had already begun to suspect that what usually happens next was not a question her world often needed to consider. The hall around them continued its slow recovery, though it still felt slightly misaligned, like a carefully calibrated machine that had been nudged just enough to notice. In the usual sequence, she said at last, you would not be here. Ren nodded. Right, that tracks. I've been getting that impression. You would be removed, she continued, her tone calm, almost instructional. Quietly, efficiently, without disruption. Ren glanced around at the hundreds of beings pretending not to listen. I feel like we've already missed the without disruption part. Ivara followed his gaze, her eyes moving across the room with a quiet authority that caused several delegates to suddenly become very interested in their own tables. Yes, she said. We have. Ren shifted slightly in his seat, testing the chair again. It adjusted to him with unnerving loyalty. Just to clarify, he added, the removed part, does that involve relocation or something more permanent? Ivara looked back at him. Relocation. He let out a breath. Good. I'm very fond of being in one piece. Another small pause settled between them, but this one felt less like tension and more like space being shared. Ren became aware that the hum of the translation fields had softened around their table, as if the room itself had decided not to interfere with whatever was happening here. You asked what happens next, Ivar said. I did. I'm still hoping the answer doesn't involve me apologizing to an entire galaxy. She tilted her head slightly, considering him. Next, you remain. Ren blinked again. We're continuing with the remain strategy. Yes. Bold, he said. Consistent. I like it. A faint ripple moved through the air above their table, and a series of delicate holographic symbols appeared, shifting and rearranging themselves in patterns Ren could not begin to interpret. His wrist console flickered back to life, displaying a rapid stream of notifications, most of which seemed to be variations of, "Are you aware of what you have done?" He muted it immediately. Is that about me? He asked, gesturing toward the floating symbols. It is about the situation, Ivara replied. That's a very diplomatic way of saying yes. Her gaze returned to him, steady as ever. You are now part of it. Ren leaned back a fraction, then caught himself and sat upright again. I was hoping to remain more of a background detail, perhaps a footnote, something easily ignored. You are not easily ignored. I'm starting to notice that, he said dryly. From across the hall, a tall, angular figure began to approach their table. Its form seemed to shift as it moved, edges becoming curves, curves becoming something else entirely. Ren watched it with growing concern. That looks important, he murmured. It is, Ivara said. Is it coming here? Yes. Ren nodded slowly. Of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? The figure stopped a short distance from the table, its presence causing the air around it to distort slightly. When it spoke, its voice carried both through the translation field and directly into the mind, the two layers slightly out of sync. Queen Ivara, it said, inclining its form in what Ren assumed was a respectful gesture. This deviation, Ivara raised one hand, a small, precise movement. The figure stopped speaking immediately. It is not a deviation, she said. It is an occurrence. Ren glanced between them. That sounds better, he whispered. Occurrence feels less punishable. The figure's attention shifted to Ren, and for a moment he had the distinct impression of being scanned, measured, and possibly categorized under unexpected variables. This human, the figure said, has occupied a restricted position. Ren gave a small, polite nod. That would be me. I can vacate if needed. I have experience with standing. Avera did not look at him. He will remain. The figure paused, not hesitated, paused as if recalculating something fundamental. This is not in accordance with... It is now, Avara said. The statement settled into the space like something solid. Ren, who had no authority whatsoever, tried very hard not to look like he was sitting next to someone who could casually redefine accordance for an entire diplomatic assembly. The figure inclined its form again, more deeply this time. As you decree. It withdrew, its shifting outline blending back into the movement of the hall. Ren watched it go, then slowly turned back to Ivara. You just changed a rule, didn't you? I clarified it. Right, he said. Clarified. That's what that looked like. He exhaled, running a hand briefly through his hair, before remembering that even that might be observed and interpreted. I should probably say something appropriately diplomatic, he added, something about honor and gratitude and the importance of cross-cultural understanding. Ivara regarded him with quiet interest. You may. Ren thought for a moment. Thank you for not having me removed, he said. A flicker of something, definitely amusement this time, passed through her expression. You are welcome, he nodded, satisfied. Yes, that felt right. Simple, honest, minimal risk of accidentally declaring war. The constellations above them resumed their slow, shifting dance, as if acknowledging that whatever disruption had occurred was now part of the pattern. Ivra leaned slightly closer, not enough to draw attention, but enough that her presence felt more immediate. You do not fear me, she said. Ren considered that carefully. I think, he replied, choosing his words with unusual precision, that I don't understand you well enough to be afraid in the way I probably should be. Her eyes held his. That is rare. I've been told I have a talent for rare situations, he said, mostly by people who are no longer responsible for me. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ivara's gaze shifted back to the hall, to the delegates who were once again pretending not to watch them, to the systems that were quietly adapting to a change they had not been designed to accommodate. This will have consequences, she said. Ren followed her gaze, then looked back at her. Yes, he agreed. It usually does. He allowed himself a small, careful smile. But, he added, so far none of them have involved me being removed. Ivara's expression softened, just enough to suggest that, for now, that particular outcome remained unlikely. The banquet resumed in form, but not in spirit. Something had shifted too far to return neatly to its original alignment, and everyone in the hall seemed aware of it, even those pretending not to be. Ren found that the longer he remained seated beside Ivara, the more the silence changed shape. It was no longer shock, it was calculation. He took another cautious sphere from the dish in front of him, holding it between his fingers like a philosophical problem. I think this one is judging me, he murmured. It is not sentient, Ivara said. That's exactly what a non-sentient organism would want me to believe. She did not respond immediately, but the faintest trace of amusement lingered in her gaze. Ren placed the sphere back. I'll let it reflect on its life choices. Across the hall, a new wave of movement began. Servitors glided between tables, adjusting placements, replacing dishes, recalibrating the rhythm of the event. Above, the living constellations shifted into a more structured pattern, their slow rotations aligning into symmetrical forms. Ren noticed that several delegates were now subtly repositioning themselves, as if preparing for something. That looks coordinated, he said quietly. It is, Ivara replied. Should I be concerned? Yes. Ren nodded once. I appreciate the honesty. A low resonance spread through the hall, not a sound exactly, but a vibration that seemed to pass through the floor, the air, and even the chair beneath him. His wrist console flickered again, displaying a single line of text before dimming once more. Ceremonial sequence initiated. Ren stared at it. That sounds official. It is, Ivara said. And I am currently part of it. Yes, he exhaled slowly. Of course I am. The central space of the hall began to clear, the delegates drawing back just enough to form a wide, open circle. At its center, a column of light rose from the floor, coalescing into a complex geometric structure that shifted and unfolded in ways Ren's eyes struggled to follow. What is that? He asked. A declaration field, Ivara said. It is used to formalize positions, alliances, and acknowledgements. Ren glanced at her. Acknowledgements of what? Her eyes met his again. That depends on what is being declared. He had the distinct feeling that this was not reassuring. A figure stepped into the light, tall, robed in layers of material that seemed to exist slightly out of phase with the rest of reality. Its voice, when it spoke, carried across the hall without the aid of translation, understood by all. The sequence proceeds, it announced. The deviation is recognized. Ren leaned slightly toward Ivara. I don't like being referred to as the deviation. It feels personal. It is accurate, she said. Fair, he admitted. The figure in the light continued, its form shifting subtly with each word. The presence of the human representative within the sovereign adjacency of the Sulcan throne position has altered the parameters of the summit. Ren blinked. That's a very long way of saying I sat in the wrong chair. Ivra did not look away from the center. Language expands to accommodate significance. I prefer shorter sentences, Ren said. They feel less dangerous. The light intensified, patterns within it rearranging at increasing speed. By ancient accord, the figure declared, such an occurrence requires resolution. Ren straightened. Resolution sounds final. It can be, Avara said. He swallowed, then forced a small smile. All right, let's resolve things. I'm a big fan of non-destructive resolutions. The figure turned, its attention now clearly directed toward their table. The Queen of the Solkan Dominion will state her position. A ripple moved through the hall, subtle but unmistakable. Every presence seemed to focus inward, converging on Avara. Ren glanced at her. No pressure. She rose. The movement was smooth, unhurried, but it carried a weight that shifted the entire atmosphere. As she stood, the chair adjusted behind her, its surface dimming slightly, as if acknowledging the temporary absence of its rightful occupant. Ren remained seated, suddenly very aware of his continued existence. Avara stepped forward, her form outlined briefly by the ambient light as she moved toward the center. The long, elegant lines of her figure were reflected in the shifting geometry around her, her presence integrating seamlessly with the structure of the declaration field. Ren watched, trying to remain calm, which mostly involved not doing anything at all. The figure inclined its form toward her. State your position. Avara did not hesitate. The human remains, she said. The words were simple, direct. They did not echo, did not expand into layered interpretations. They simply existed, clear and unambiguous. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the light reacted. The geometric structure fractured, not violently, but decisively, splitting into multiple overlapping configurations, each one attempting to reconcile the statement with the established protocols. Ren could almost feel the systems recalculating, searching for a path that did not exist. That doesn't look stable, he whispered to himself. Across the hall, several delegates shifted, their composure slipping just enough to reveal something closer to genuine surprise. The servitors paused mid-motion, their smooth routines interrupted. The figure in the center adjusted, its form becoming more defined, more rigid. This position contradicts established law, it said. Avara's voice did not change. Then the law is incomplete. Ren closed his eyes briefly. She's very good at that, he murmured. The light surged again, patterns accelerating, overlapping, collapsing and reforming in rapid succession. The declaration field was trying, failing, to contain the statement within its existing structure. The occurrence cannot be integrated, the figure said. Then it will be acknowledged, Avara replied. The distinction hung in the air, subtle but profound. Ren opened his eyes, watching as the entire hall seemed to lean into the moment, drawn toward the point where something fundamental was being redefined. He let out a slow breath. Well, he said quietly, this escalated. The light pulsed once more, brighter than before, and then, unexpectedly, it stabilized. Not in the way it had before, but in a new configuration, one that had not existed until this moment. The occurrence is acknowledged, the figure announced. A wave of reaction moved through the hall. Not noise, not chaos, but a collective shift in understanding. Something had changed, and it was not going back. Ren sat very still, absorbing the fact that he was now, officially, an acknowledged occurrence. I was really aiming for forgettable detail, he muttered. Avara turned, her gaze finding him across the distance. For the first time since he had sat down, Ren realized that the silence in the room was no longer directed at him. It was directed at what he represented, and somehow, that felt even more dangerous. The hall did not erupt. That more than anything, unsettled Ren. There was no chaos, no shouting, no immediate unraveling of diplomatic order. Instead, everything resumed, smoothly, almost too smoothly, like a system that had decided to accept an error rather than correct it. He remained in the chair. That detail felt increasingly important. The declaration field dissolved into strands of light that drifted upward and disappeared into the living ceiling. The geometric structures folded into themselves as if embarrassed by their earlier confusion. Around the hall, delegates returned to their tables, though the angles of their movements had changed, slightly sharper, slightly more deliberate. Ren leaned forward, resting his elbows carefully on the table, as though sudden enthusiasm might still be illegal. "I'm still here," he said quietly, mostly to confirm it for himself. "You are," Avara replied as she returned to her seat. The chair welcomed her back with a subtle shift in its surface, its reflective patterns aligning once more with her presence. Ren noticed with growing suspicion that it did not react the same way to him. "Good," he said. "I was concerned that the acknowledgement might involve me becoming a symbolic memory." Avara glanced at him. "It does not." "That's reassuring. I prefer being physically present for my own experiences." A brief pause followed, but this one carried less tension and more weight, the kind that settled in after something irreversible had already happened. Ren picked up his drink again. It had stopped vibrating entirely, which he took as a sign of emotional maturity. "So," he continued, "just to clarify our current situation, I accidentally sat in your seat, disrupted a centuries-old protocol, triggered a ceremonial process, and now I'm officially recognized by whatever that was." "Yes. And this is acceptable." "It is acknowledged." Ren nodded slowly. "Right. Different word. Same level of concern." Across the hall, movement resumed with a new rhythm. Several delegates began approaching one another in small clusters, their interactions more focused now, less performative. Ren noticed that some of them were glancing toward him, not openly, but often enough to make it clear that his presence had not been absorbed into normalcy. "I think I've become a topic," he said. "You have," Ivra confirmed. "That's unfortunate. I was hoping to remain more of a background noise." "You are not noise." Ren considered that. "I'm not sure if that's better." A soft chime echoed through the hall, different from the earlier resonance. This one was lighter, almost conversational. Above, the constellations shifted again, forming patterns that resembled pathways, lines connecting distant points in a web of faint glowing threads. "What's happening now?" Ren asked. "The secondary exchanges," Avara said. "Direct negotiations. Adjustments." "Adjustments caused by me," he added. "In part." He exhaled. "I should start charging for this." Avra's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than usual. "You are already being considered." Ren froze. That sentence had layers I don't fully understand. "It will become clearer." "I'm not sure I want it to," he admitted. Before she could respond, a presence approached their table again, different from the earlier figure, but no less deliberate. This one was smaller, more compact, its form composed of interlocking plates that shifted with each movement. It stopped at a respectful distance. "Human representative," it said, its voice filtered through a perfectly calibrated translation field. "You are requested." Ren pointed lightly at himself. "That's me. Still getting used to that phrase." The being inclined slightly. "Your presence has introduced variables. Clarification is required." Ren glanced at Avara. "Do I have a choice?" "Yes," she said. He waited. "You may refuse," she added. Ren looked back at the waiting figure, then back at Avara. "Would refusing create more problems than accepting?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded. "Then I accept. I'm very cooperative when faced with abstract consequences." The being gestured toward a nearby section of the hall, where a smaller enclosed space had formed, its boundaries defined by a faint, shimmering barrier. Ren stood. The chair released him reluctantly, its surface flattening, as if disappointed. "I'll be back," he said to it under his breath. Evera rose as well. The being paused. "The request is for the human representative." "He does not attend alone," Evera said. There was no argument. Ren glanced at her. "I appreciate that," he said quietly. "Also, it significantly increases my chances of not saying the wrong thing." "You will still say the wrong thing," she replied. "Probably," he admitted. They moved together toward the enclosed space, the barrier parting as they approached. Inside, the air felt different, denser, more focused, as if designed to contain not just sound, but intention. Several figures were already present, their forms arranged in a loose circle. As Ren and Evera entered, the barrier sealed behind them with a soft, final hum. Ren looked around. "All right," he said, straightening slightly. "This feels official. I should probably try to look like I know what I'm doing." You do not, Avara said. I know, he replied, but I can approximate confidence. One of the figures stepped forward, its form stabilizing into something vaguely symmetrical. You have altered the equilibrium, it said. Ren nodded. I've been told that. I didn't mean to. Intent is noted, but not relevant. Story of my life, Ren muttered. The figure continued. The Sulcan Queen has acknowledged your presence. This creates a relational anomaly. Ren blinked. I'm sorry, a what? Avara's voice came calmly beside him. They mean that our interaction now has implications beyond protocol. Ren looked at her. Of course it does. He turned back to the figure. And what exactly does this relational anomaly require? A brief pause. Definition. Ren stared at it. Definition, he repeated. You want me to define this? Yes. He glanced at Avara again, then back at the gathered figures. I sat in a chair, he said. That is insufficient. I agree, he said quickly. It felt insufficient at the time as well. The figures remained still, waiting. Ren took a slow breath, then let it out. All right, he said. Let me try this differently. He gestured lightly between himself and Avara. I didn't know who she was, he said. I didn't know the rules. I just saw an empty seat and made a decision based on incomplete information. He paused, searching for the right words. And she didn't remove me, he added. The silence in the chamber deepened, not tense, but attentive. That's it? One of the figures asked. Ren shrugged slightly. That's the honest version. Avara's gaze remained on him, steady and unreadable. The figures shifted, their forms adjusting in subtle, complex ways. Honesty, one of them said slowly, is not a recognized parameter in this context. Ren smiled faintly. Maybe it should be. For a moment, nothing moved. Then quietly, something began to change. The chamber did not react immediately, which was somehow worse than if it had rejected him outright. The figures remained still, their surfaces shifting in faint, analytical ripples, as if Ren's words had been placed into a system that did not quite know where to store them. Ren cleared his throat. That was my best attempt at a definition, he said. I can try a more complicated one if necessary, but historically, that makes things worse. Your statement introduces an unstructured variable, one of the figures replied. That sounds like a polite way of saying I'm confusing, Ren said. It is a precise way of saying you do not conform. Ren nodded. Yes, that's been a recurring theme tonight. Avara stepped slightly forward, not interrupting, but shifting the balance of the space. The figures adjusted, subtly but unmistakably, acknowledging her presence as something that did not require permission. Explain the variable, one of them said. Ren blinked. I thought I just did. In greater detail, he exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair again before remembering, too late, that every small gesture here seemed to carry unintended significance. All right, he said. Let me think. He looked at Avara, then at the assembled figures, then briefly at the barrier behind them, as if considering escape routes that definitely did not exist. Where I come from, he began, we have rules. Lots of them. Some are written, some are less written, but the interesting part is that we don't always follow them. The figures did not react, but the air in the chamber seemed to tighten slightly, as if the idea itself required more processing power than expected. Not because we're trying to cause problems, Ren continued, but because sometimes we don't know the rules exist, or we misunderstand them, or we just choose differently. He paused, glancing at Avara. And sometimes, he added, something happens that wasn't supposed to happen, and instead of correcting it immediately, we wait. We see what it becomes. Silence. One of the figures shifted its form into a sharper configuration. This approach lacks stability. Absolutely, Ren said. It's incredibly unstable. We do it anyway. Another figure leaned slightly forward. Why? Ren smiled faintly. Because sometimes the unstable thing turns out to be important. That hung in the chamber for a moment, heavier than his earlier words. Avara's gaze remained on him, but there was something different in it now. Not analysis, not curiosity alone, but recognition of something she had already begun to understand. The human suggests that deviation may produce value, one of the figures said. Ren raised a finger. I would like to officially support that suggestion. Value is defined by outcome, another replied. Then we're in a waiting phase, Ren said, which I'll admit is not the most comfortable place to be. A faint hum passed through the barrier, as if the chamber itself was reacting to the exchange. Ren's wrist console flickered again, displaying fragmented lines of data that reassembled too quickly for him to follow. Are we being recorded? He asked. Yes, Ibarra said. Good, he said. I'd like history to know I tried. The figures shifted again, their forms now less rigid, more fluid, as if the conversation had altered the way they occupied space. The relational anomaly remains undefined, one of them said. Ren sighed. I was afraid of that. Ibarra stepped forward another fraction, her presence now fully integrated into the center of the chamber. It is not undefined, she said. The figures turned toward her as one. It is unclassified. Ren glanced at her. That sounds better. It is more accurate, she replied. The figures processed this, their forms flickering with internal adjustments. Unclassified states require containment, one of them said. Ren immediately raised both hands. I would like to opt out of containment. Avra did not look at him. No, Ren blinked. No to containment or no to opting out? Yes. He lowered his hands slowly. That was not as helpful as I hoped. The chamber fell into another layered silence, but this one felt different. Less like a system struggling, more like one adapting. Containment is not required, one of the figures said at last. Ren exhaled. That's the best sentence I've heard all evening. Observation will continue. That's less comforting, but still acceptable. The barrier around the chamber flickered, its surface thinning, as if the space itself was preparing to release them back into the larger hall. The anomaly persists, another figure added. Ren nodded. I'll do my best to remain consistent. Ibarra turned toward him, her expression calm, but there was a quiet intensity beneath it now. You will not be consistent, she said. Ren smiled slightly. That's also been a recurring theme. The barrier dissolved completely, the hum fading into the ambient sound of the banquet hall. Outside, the delegates had not dispersed. If anything, more of them had gathered, their attention carefully disguised but unmistakably focused. Ren stepped out first, then paused, glancing back at the chamber that no longer existed. Well, he said quietly, that could have gone worse. Ibarra moved beside him, her presence once again altering the space around them. It did not, she said. He looked at her, then out at the hall, where the patterns of movement had shifted once more to accommodate something new. I have a feeling, Ren said, that this isn't over. Avra's gaze followed his, taking in the subtle changes, the recalibrated positions, the quiet tension that had not resolved, only transformed. It is not, she said. Ren nodded, then straightened slightly, as if preparing himself for whatever came next. Good, he said. I was starting to get comfortable. And somewhere above them, the constellations rearranged again. This time not into patterns of order, but into something far less predictable. The banquet did not end with a signal. It unraveled, slowly, like a thought that had reached its conclusion and no longer needed to be held together. Conversations shifted from guarded exchanges into quieter, more deliberate ones, and the hall, once rigid in its purpose, began to feel almost flexible. Ren stood beside the chair. He had not sat down again. That felt important. I think it's looking at me, he said, glancing down at it. It is a chair, Ibarra replied. Yes, Ren said, but it has opinions. I can tell. The chair remained silent, which Ren interpreted as dignified restraint. Around them, the delegates were no longer pretending not to watch. Some observed openly now. Others approached in measured intervals, their curiosity no longer concealed behind protocol. The word had spread, not just of what had happened, but of what had not happened. No removal, no correction, no restoration of the old order. Ren folded his arms loosely. I feel like I should say something wise, he murmured. Something that justifies all of this. You are not required to justify it, Ibarra said. That's unfortunate, he replied. I've been practicing. She turned slightly toward him, her long ears catching the soft light from above. You have changed the structure of the summit. Ren shook his head. I think I just interrupted it. And it adapted. He considered that. That's a nicer way of saying it. Across the hall, the same figure from the declaration field reappeared, though less imposing now. Its form no longer dominating the space but existing within it. It approached without ceremony. The summit concludes, it said. The occurrence has been integrated. Ren blinked. Integrated? That sounds, stable. It is not fully stable, the figure replied, but it is accepted. Ren nodded slowly. I'll take that. The figure turned its attention to Avara. The Sulcan Dominion's position has shifted. It has, she said. Your authority has been reinterpreted. Ren glanced between them. That sounds complicated. It is, Avara said calmly. The figure inclined its form once more. Further adjustments will follow. Of course they will, Ren muttered. The figure withdrew, leaving them once again in the open space of the hall. Ren exhaled, long and steady. So that's it, he said. I came here by accident, sat in the wrong chair, disrupted an entire system, and now everything is different. Yes, he looked at her. And you're all right with that. Avara met his gaze. I am aware of it. That's not the same thing, he said gently. No, she agreed. It is not. A pause settled between them, but this one carried something new, something quieter, deeper than the earlier tension. Ren glanced around the hall one last time. The constellations above had settled into a pattern he didn't recognize, something asymmetrical but balanced in its own way. Delegates were leaving now, their movements less rigid, their conversations less guarded. I think I'm supposed to go back to being normal, he said. Ivara tilted her head slightly. Define normal. Ren smiled faintly. That's a dangerous question. He hesitated, then added, Before this, I was invisible. I followed instructions, stayed within boundaries, avoided exactly this kind of situation. And now, Ren looked down at the chair again, then back at her. Now I'm the reason a system had to change, he said. Which is not something I planned. Ivara studied him. Do you regret it? He thought about that, about the silence, the attention, the weight of being seen in a place that had no expectation of him. No, he said finally, I don't think I do. The answer surprised him. Avara's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Good, she said. Ren let out a small breath, almost a laugh. That's a relief. I was worried I'd have to pretend this was all part of some grand diplomatic strategy. You did not pretend, she said. No, he agreed. I just didn't know enough to be afraid. Avara stepped closer, not enough to draw attention, but enough that her presence felt immediate again, the way it had when everything first went silent. That is why you were not removed, she said. Ren met her gaze. Because I didn't know the rules. Because you did not let them define your action. He considered that, then shook his head slightly. I think I just made a mistake. Avara's eyes held his, and we did not correct it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ren smiled, small but genuine. That might be the most important part. The hall continued to empty around them, the vast space gradually returning to something quieter, less charged. The chair remained between them, no longer a boundary, but not entirely neutral either. So, Ren said, glancing at it one last time, what happens to the chair? It remains, Ivara said. Of course it does, he replied. Consistent. I respect that. He took a step back, then another, creating a small distance. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. I should go, he said. Yes. He nodded, then hesitated. I'm still not entirely sure what this was, he admitted. Avara's expression softened, just enough to change the way the light reflected in her eyes. It does not require a name, she said. Ren let out a quiet breath. That's good. I'm terrible at naming things. He turned, beginning to walk toward the exit, then stopped after a few steps and looked back. Avara was still there, standing beside the chair, her presence anchoring the space even as everything else shifted around her. "For what it's worth," Ren said, "I'm glad I sat there." Ivare did not move. "So am I," she said. Ren nodded once, then turned again, this time continuing without stopping. As he left the hall, the constellations above shifted one final time, not into order, not into symmetry, but into something open, patterns that did not close, pathways that did not end. Behind him, the chair remained, and for the first time in its long existence, it was no longer defined by who could not sit in it, but by the moment someone had.